Have you been able to identify any sort of high-level factors that can explain why WA and Queensland, for instance, have had such higher percentage of proportions there, or thinking and reasons for it?
WA grew by 2.8%, and you can compare that. So that's double the rate of growth of South Australia, which was 1.4, and higher than Queensland and Victoria, which were next, 2.4 and 2.3. Now, obviously, they're bigger states, so they're growing by more, but as a percentage, WA has been growing the fastest. And we ticked over 3 million people late last year, WA.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here's your host, Jared Mann.
Today, we've got Grant Dusting on the show, and he was on our show last year. If you didn't catch it, it was one of our most popular episodes of 2024. And so I had to get him back on today. And we're talking about some of the trends to watch in 2025. And he's from McCrindle. They're demographers, and they make, big data makes sense to a lot of different governments and corporations. And I like to think that us as investors can learn a lot too and inform, the decisions that we make. So thanks for coming on the show again, Grant.
Oh, thanks, Jared. I'm excited to be back on. Thank you.
Awesome. So take us through some of the outcomes of your, report that you recently released and what some of those things might mean to us property investors.
Would love to. And I think as you outlined there, just telling listeners what McCrindle, who we are and what we do. And I'd say when I'm talking to people, I often boil it down to saying we love to study how people in society are changing and what does that mean for leaders, for business leaders, people working in planning communities and establishing them and thinking about how people's needs and wants are changing. So there's never a dull moment. There's always a new trend, something happening. And
well, it seems that way over the last 5 or 10 years. Do you think the rate of change in your industry is getting faster like the rate of change in many others, or is it just that we're more aware? As a first question to you.
Yeah, I think we are more aware. So I think that's a good call out. But absolutely, the pace of change is accelerating. I think without exception, every person, every leader we speak to feels that way. So yeah, I think if listeners are feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the change, I know it's a bit cold comfort, but everyone else is feeling the same way. So we're all in the same boat. Yeah, it definitely is. And it's just an accelerated pace of change, and technology plays a part in that. I think our, population, like the world's population, by historic standards, it's increasing. It's an exponential kind of curve. So there's more people, there's more ideas, there's more things happening, and it's just, we all feel that. So yeah, I saw a sign in a secondhand bookshop the other day, and it said the post-apocalyptical section has now been moved to the current affairs section. Basically, all those things that used to be like end of the world kind of stuff, it's now like, oh, that's just what you see on the news every night. So, and that was a bit of a gag that they put up, but I thought, oh, yeah, that feels true in lots of ways. So yeah, so I think one of the pieces of research that we put out, McCrindle puts out every year, is our trends of the year. So listeners can access that. We've got like the infographic summary version that's free online, and then people can access the report or the webinar if they're interested, just Googling trends of 2025 McCrindle. But so I thought there's a couple of things that we're tracking for 2025 that I think would be really of interest to your listeners, and even a couple of things that we highlighted in 2024, which is still very much kind of emerging relevant trends. Sometimes we'll highlight a trend and it kind of starts to get traction, but sometimes it's only a couple of years later that it really is in full swing. So I thought, yeah, there's a couple of things that I'm excited to talk about today.
Well, they say in investing that the trend is your friend. So it's good to know what these are.
Yeah, and so to kick off, one of our trends for 2025, we named it the Big Build. So that might not mean too much in a phrase. So let me unpack that for people. So when we think about population and housing, economics I did some economics units at uni, right? You can really boil it down to demand and supply. So let's consider the demand side of the equation first in terms of population and housing. So our population growth has been at record highs, and this is true nationally across Australia. But actually, Perth and WA have really been leading the way since COVID, along with Queensland, which pretty much since about 2020, it's been WA, Queensland right at the top of the charts for population growth rate as a percentage. Now, the thing about Australia's population growth is it's largely driven by overseas migration. And really, historically, over the last, say, 20 to 30 years, it's about 60% of our population growth comes from migration, and about the remaining 40% is from natural increase, so births minus deaths. So it's historically been about 60-40 in terms of the split. But just to give you an idea of the scale of actually just the overseas migration we've been having since the borders reopened post-COVID, we're actually getting double the annual migration. Say in the last year, we had over 500,000 people migrate to Australia, whereas in 2019 it was just under 250,000. So basically, it's we're about 2 years on from the kind of international borders reopening, and while that has trended down slightly, it's still double what we were getting pre-COVID. So that's really been a key driver for the population growth, is that overseas migration. And as I said, WA is leading the way in population growth. And a lot of that is through overseas migration, as well as interstate migration. So people from the east moving across to the promised land in WA.
I know every person's reason will be different for migration, but have you been able to identify any sort of high-level factors that can explain why WA and Queensland, for instance, have had such higher percentage of proportions there? Or I've got my own thinking and reasons for it, which I kind of delve into on the show regularly. But yeah, it'd be good to get your take because this is your area. So,
well, I'd say your intuition's probably pretty good. So would love to hear anything you want to add as well. But yeah, when we've kind of run national surveys and we've asked Australians, what words do you associate with a city? Because the other thing I should say beforehand is that the vast majority of our population growth and of our migration in Australia and in WA, it's to the capital cities. So in WA, that's obviously Perth. To the extent that Perth, you think about how big WA is, but actually the proportion of Western Australians who live in Perth, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's like 85% plus. So we've got such a huge landmass, but we're all concentrated in Perth. And that's true for Australia. I mean, 2 out of 5 people who live in Australia live in Sydney or Melbourne. So we've got this massive country, but we're all concentrated in the city. So we're a very city-driven culture. Now, when we've asked Australians what words they associate with cities, they say the top words they associate with cities are expensive, congested, noisy, overpopulated, and there is one positive one in the mix. It was diverse. So there's a positive word. But I think that gives us some clues why people are flocking to WA and Queensland, because if people are saying, oh, when I think of cities, I think expensive, congested, noisy, overpopulated, sure, if listeners are from like a regional town and have come to Perth, they might feel that way about Perth. But actually by national standards and definitely by global standards, we've got amazing livability. We're still, even though we've had crazy house price growth in the last few years, we're still relatively affordable if you look at, say, by a national perspective or, that larger perspective. Yeah, we've got traffic congestion, but again, compared to Melbourne and Sydney, where people think that looks pretty favourable. And in terms of noise and overpopulation, like we've got lots of green space, lots of beautiful clean air. So I think we probably get some hints there. It is interesting that the 2 fastest growing states are really the 2 biggest lifestyle states, WA and Queensland. So I think that would be some big hints there about why people move to WA.
yeah, well, that's all pretty consistent. I think the affordability piece on the backdrop of interest rates has been even more important. And I think family, what appeals to families in that lifestyle, in the family formation stages is pretty key. So I think you're really right when you talk about the opposite of the negatives that a family would be wanting. So
Yeah, and then in addition to the lifestyle benefits, the other big thing is the economic attraction and just the economic activity. And we know that WA's economy has been going gangbusters, even through COVID, just with the resources sector. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at population growth over the last, say, 30 years and our economic activity and economic output, they track pretty closely together. So I think you've got the lifestyle factors and then you've got the economic factors of, well, people want to find work. There's great options in WA. You've got the strongest economy in the nation, the biggest state budget surplus. So I'd say between those factors, that would probably explain a lot of the population growth.
well, looking around, as you said, with the strength of the economy, you look around to some of the other capitals and Melbourne and Victoria, for instance, they're in a world of hurt, and I can't sort of see how they're going to get out of that for a long while with their economy. So it does play a really big factor, because then it's almost like a vicious cycle. So they're raising their land taxes and being a lot harder on taxing their citizens and making it more detracting of people wanting to go there. And then there's less population growth, less uplift in prices, less overall desire for people to live there, and it kind of can spiral downwards for a while. So how do you, obviously we're in a upward spiral phase at the moment. Not too long ago, we were it seemed like things went downward for longer than we all thought. What do you sort of see for the cycles ahead? And I know that could be a really broad, big question, because there's so many intermoving parts, and we've got the need for resources globally and how that impacts us, and we've got America and its relationships with the things changing over to another government, and we've got our state government and our federal government elections this year as well, and then we've got China and how much demand sort of comes from them, and what our relationship to them and the complexity of that, and the need for our different services, resources, and all that stuff. So there's a lot of darts I just threw at you. See what you can throw back at me.
Oh, that's a great point. And it does, just rattling off those things, it does feel like you have to be an expert in geopolitics these days to try to make sense of where things are going. And I mean, prediction's always a fool's game. So you have to be a bit, we as a company try to, have a posture of be a bit circumspect in that. But I think we try to pay attention to, we use the analogy of, most people tend to watch the waves, but we try to look at the tides when you think about trend spotting. So I think that's something that I would encourage listeners to think about. It's it's easy to just get kind of absorbed into the things that are crashing in front of you, the waves, because they're noisy, they're frothy, everyone's looking at them, talking about them. But actually, if you want to think ahead, what's going to probably influence the coming period is actually the tides. So if you look out and just kind of gauge the movement of the tides in and out, those things happen more incrementally, but actually they can have a bigger impact over time. So
good one. I love that analogy, because I don't know if you know Warren Buffett saying that when the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming naked. So that's always been a favorite one of mine.
Yeah, he's got some crackers. So yeah, I think
let's go a bit deeper into that big build trend that you spoke of.
A bit deeper into the wave. I like that, and picking up the metaphor. So again, if we think about where things are heading, well, what are the underlying drivers? So we've talked about population growth. So even just thinking about that. So I said that WA is leading the nation in the population growth, and to put some numbers to that, in the last financial year, WA grew by 2.8%. And you can compare that. So that's double the rate of growth of South Australia, which was 1.4, and higher than Queensland and Victoria, which were next, 2.4 and 2.3. Now, obviously, they're bigger states, so they're growing by more, but as a percentage, WA has been growing the fastest. And we ticked over 3 million people late last year, WA.
Oh, wow. Didn't know that.
Yeah, and adding about 80,000 people annually. So again, I think if we think about those lifestyle factors, are they going away? Well, actually, sure, there's going to be little changes around the edge. around the edges, but actually I think those things that are lifestyle attractors to Perth and WA, there's you can have confidence that those will continue, particularly as people look at the other options around, which might be becoming less attractive, less affordable, less kind of amenable in their lifestyle. So in terms of predicting the economy and geopolitics, I definitely wouldn't want to make a prediction on that. I leave that to others to try and fail at. But I think, yeah, the fundamentals, if we think about our WA and Perth's position, in proximity to Asia. So actually our strongest migration. So China remains our biggest kind of economic driver, if you like, our biggest market for Australia and for Perth specific or WA specifically. We're very reliant. But in terms of the population, actually, it's India is where we get most of our overseas migration from, and that's been the case the last kind of decade has been trending up in terms of the proportion from India. So again, a very fast growing kind of nation and kind of an emerging middle class too. So I think there's factors there kind of domestically in India, which that middle class will continue to grow, and people will be looking for greener pastures to kind of set up a new life. And I think Perth will continue to be an attractive and relatively close in terms of global proximity place to do that. So there's factors there that would lead one to think that these things could continue. So those are some initial thoughts.
Yeah, cool. So how does that relate to the big build? Is this all about how we cater to this population growth? Like, unpack this for me.
Yeah, sure. So again, economics, demand, supply. So we've been talking about the demand, the population growth, and from our vantage point, a lot of those drivers are going to continue. It's just a question of how much. So the demand will continue to be there. The challenge, of course, has been the supply has not kept up with the demand, and that's leading to not only the house price kind of growth, but also the challenges with infrastructure playing catch up. And I think we can say that of not just of Perth and WA, but nationally, that's the case. That really successive governments have just been doing their best to play catch up to this strong population growth. So in fact, the ABS just released data this week on new dwelling completions. You might have seen that. The Property Council put out some media around that. So
I saw Roger's been spruiking it, help his election chances.
Yep. And of course, the federal government's made these big commitments to, building new homes and things, but it definitely seems the big build is on. And the new data from the ABS, which was from the September quarter in 2024, showed that actually WA new home completions jumped 33% compared to the previous quarter. So that's just under 6,000 homes were built in those 3 months. And that was quite a significant jump previously, and I think suggests that actually a lot of this noise and concerted effort is making a dent. So it remains to be seen, will that continue? However, even with that jump, 33% up from the previous quarter, we actually still fell behind the target by 500 homes. So it just goes to show that this target is going to be ambitious. And even then, that's only going to really catch us up. But if our population continues to grow strongly, we're going to keep falling behind again. So that's the big challenge when it comes to the big build. So what we're saying is the big build is needed both in homes, but also infrastructure. And I think we see in WA the big investment in Metronet and kind of the rail infrastructure to try to service these, new communities. And actually last time we talked about just how just the scale of urban sprawl in Perth and how it's right up there in terms of the most sprawled cities in the world. And I think that presents unique challenges for those who are focused on infrastructure, whether it's transport or things like schooling and healthcare and hospitals. Like those are the big build is needed. Early signs are good, so that'll be kind of a watch this space to see if that supply can meet the demand and what's the divergence there.
Well, I was just punching some numbers into my calculator here, and if you said that our population is growing at about 80,000 and that's where it might land down from the sort of crazy peak levels, and from what I was reading the 500,000 Australia-wide was also a bit overinflated because they were processing a lot of visas for people that had actually already been here. So some of those effects might have been felt and we'd already been dealing with it. But nevertheless, they have to record when somebody actually comes here and becomes a resident, and that has to happen at some point. So there's no denying that we still have very high population growth. But yeah, if the number rests at around 80,000, I don't know. Do you have any stats on how many houses or dwellings might be needed from that many people? I usually just use the, 3 people to 1 dwelling and use that as a quick approximate to work out how many houses we might need. But I don't know if you've ever seen some data on that.
Yeah, well, it's a great point to work out. If we know the population growth, we think about how many houses we need and how does that compare with what we're building. I mean, not on hand, but I will say actually this ties into another point I was going to make around just the changing kind of social and community dynamic, because one of the tides or trends that we've been observing for several years now is actually the growing proportion of people who are living alone, kind of single person dwellings. When you look at the ABS data, that's been tracking up over time, and there's different social factors at play there, and as to why is that the case. But so that presents a challenge, an even greater challenge then, because it's you can't rely on the fact that, well, if population is growing by 80,000, it
would vary hugely. I mean, if I punch in, 3 people per household, that's 26,000 dwellings per year extra needed. But if it even goes to 2.5 or 2, and that's just in the new population coming in, what about if there's that trend changing to the existing population in households going from 3 down to 2 down to 1.5? Like, I can't, that hurts my head as to just how much demand there could come from that trend.
Yeah. So you can easily see how these trends can start to make a small change can start to make a huge difference, and that's where these social factors, like the way people want to organize themselves in families and the way people, what they value and how they do that has implications for housing and community. So yes, I think that challenge is only getting greater because there's more people now who are preferring to, or just because of life circumstances, looking to live alone, or that's their situation. So requires a different
types of accommodation. Yeah.
Yep, different housing needs, and in terms of how communities are planned, that's something that planners and developers need to take into account.
I guess it's especially hard when you take into account the desires of different populations. Like, we haven't followed the same trend as Sydney and Melbourne, and maybe they've been forced to over time to adopt that higher density, apartment type, unit type living. But here, if I asked some of these singles, do you want to go live in a high density tower, or would you prefer, a standalone small ground floor unit or villa? I'm sure they'd prefer the second of those things if we could still make it affordable for them. So there's a lot of challenges in how do we actually provide for that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that's a big challenge for developers who might otherwise, want to invest in that, but it's just looking at the potential returns, which is, and for the risk that they're taking with a big apartment or high density development. I mean, that when we've asked people, what do you really want in a community? What are the things that are priority for you? The top things are probably not surprising to someone like yourself, but listeners might appreciate hearing that, affordability comes out number one. That's people saying, when I look for a place to live, that's kind of what I'm thinking of. But actually, proximity to shops and amenities comes in at number 2. More people now are saying that they want a walkable community as well, and green space, public transport connectivity. So again, these are some things that high density can actually do well in ways that lower density kind of suburbs and areas, it's much harder to have proximity to shops and amenities if you're kind of a traditional large sprawled suburb. So I do see there are opportunities for medium and higher density accommodation to actually provide more of what people want. But but it just needs to be done well and planned in a way that makes sense in terms of the transport connectivity as well.
Well, I've especially noticed over the last 6 months, prices going up a lot more in apartments and units. So that's going to hopefully make a few more projects more profitable, to actually start moving them through and creating some new stock, because this is mainly just all established, and I rarely, if ever, seen any new stuff getting built. There's not much anywhere getting built. There's a few of the larger groups doing it, but not, the smaller apartment complexes or anything. They sort of stopped in 2015-16 and haven't really been moved forward by many people since. So, but that said, the cost to build has also continued to increase and outstrip, the outpace even the growth of house prices. So that makes it even more difficult when you've got that still increasing.
Absolutely. It's a very tricky problem, isn't it? So just building off that, we've talked about the big build, and then I've alluded to there some of the social factors at play that influence demand for housing and what people want. I mean, the really big thing that we've been tracking in terms of social trends and social challenges is just the challenge of loneliness and social isolation. And this is, there's a lot of things feeding into this, but when we think about our lives today, like a typical person in Australia or in Perth, most of our time is spent online now, whether it's on scrolling on your mobile device or on your laptop or computer or smart TV. We're just, look at so many different metrics and so many different studies. We're spending more time online than ever before. That's pretty unanimous. And it's correlated with an increased proportion of people saying, actually, I feel lonely. In studies that we've done, more than half of Australians say they feel lonely often or sometimes.
Yeah, wow. Pretty high proportion.
It is. And again, it's different to say, if we wind back a few generations, that there's always been social challenges of, people feeling left out and isolated, but it's not been felt this acutely. And what's really telling is when we've conducted these national studies, we look at who's most likely to say they feel lonely. It's actually the youngest generation, Gen Z. So those who are in their teens and 20s, actually, ironically, the generation that's grown up in the most digitally connected world, the most connected era in human history, and yet they're actually the ones who are saying they feel the most lonely. So that's a really big social challenge.
Especially when many of them potentially are still living at home and they've got families around them. So I was originally thinking, when you mentioned the loneliness factor, that it could have been tied in with, decreasing household size. And if you've got less people living with you and you go from living with your family and then you go to living by yourself, then unless you make an effort to create connections outside of the home, then life can be pretty lonely, especially if you don't go out very much, as you could probably, as many elderly people may do, especially if they are in their comfort zone and they feel like they're not, they don't have those connections and community groups and other things to get into. But interesting that you're saying it's the youngest generation that probably are upstairs from mum and dad right now, on their device, yet feeling isolated and alone. So interesting.
It's a paradox, isn't it? They're probably on, they've got more quote unquote friends and followers and connections than ever, but actually people are saying that's not doing it for me. And
it's not real or not, real relationships potentially.
And that has implications for how people engage in life. So we've asked people about their social habits. So again, people spending more time online, less time doing things in person. We've compared with a few years ago, people say through research we've conducted, they're less likely to go out for coffee with people, less likely to go out for dinner with people, less likely to gather at a local park. So some of these things which are kind of, have for a long time been pretty common part of, say, the way of life in Australia or in Perth, people are saying, I'm not doing that as much as I used to.
I wonder how much the eating out cafes, restaurants, and that is also related to spending, because I chat to some of the cafe owners around where I am, and they've had to. Some of them are now closed on Sunday, and that used to be our favourite day to go out for breakfast. I asked them, why I can't go to my favourite anymore on Sunday when I love to, and just not getting enough business. So I can sort of see the possibility how cost and the pressure of all of that is also tying in with that. It's like you don't invite your friend to go and have a coffee because it's cheaper at home, but then you don't catch up with your friend at all.
Yeah, I think it's a great pickup. And yeah, whether it's buying coffee or buying a beer and the cost of doing that, I think the cost of living is a factor in that. And I think where the rubber hits the road is that if we're talking about Generation Z, saying they're the ones who are feeling most lonely and socially isolated, well, that's our emerging generation of homeowners. So this is the generation who actually, they're the ones who are most craving that human connection because they're saying they're not getting it. So that's something that I think policymakers, town planners, investors will all need to recognize and adapt and say, well, actually, how might that influence what they want then? They're wanting to say, well, I don't have that. So actually getting that human connection, getting that sense of community is actually really important to me because I feel quite lonely. And I think that is going to already starting to influence the things that they want in their work and career, but also, their home and how they live.
Good one. Yeah, there could be some pretty creative solutions that could be applied to attracting people to live in certain areas if they can cater to that need, I guess. But it's pretty hard to fight the trend. So that's the other thing.
Yeah, there's often a trend and then a counter trend, and it's trying to pick which one's going to be more prominent. But even take something like, I don't know if you've come across or very familiar with, say, like a run clubs. It just seems the last few years, run clubs have just kind of sprung up, and now it's this big thing. And actually, it's the Gen Zs who are really driving that. And so it kind of checks out that the generation is saying, "Oh, I'm feeling lonely. I'm looking for community. Don't want to, don't have a lot of money to spend."
Much greater focus on your health and fitness seems to be emerging as well.
So so that there's a way that they can go, oh, I'm getting exercise, which I know I want to do. I'm getting that sense of community. I'm not paying money for a gym membership or a class. It's a just a run around the whether it's a park run or whatever. So I think that, these things get expressed in different ways. But when it comes to how communities are planned, I think anyone who's prioritizing that human connection is going to be hitting a real need going forwards.
Good one. And did you have any other big trends to chat through with us, or?
Well, probably the last one that I wanted to highlight is more of an economic one that, again, we've started to see kind of bubbling away the last couple of years. Is we hear a lot in the media when they talk about the cost of living and housing affordability. We hear the saying, the bank of mum and dad, and referring to, of course, people relying on parents or a parent providing financial support, either as they, for their education or for their, their first home and just getting that leg up. But what's interesting is actually we've been seeing more and more grandparents actually supporting their grandchildren financially. So in a way, it's evolved from not just the bank of mum and dad, but the bank of nan and pop now, it seems. And why is that happening? Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is actually that generation, the baby boomers. If you look at the metrics, they've largely, as a generation, have accumulated, really, they've been blessed with wealth that's been tied up largely in their appreciating home value of their own home. And they've, done well out of that. So actually, so much of Australia's wealth is concentrated in kind of that older demographic. And a lot of them, naturally, if they've got family, children, grandchildren, they naturally want to help out. So it does seem to be an emerging trend that the bank of nan and pop are stepping in to help with a financial leg up. And to put a stat on that, when we've surveyed nationally just people to ask about their financial situation and some of the things around that, we found that when it comes to Gen Z, 60% of Gen Z say they've received some form of financial support from their grandparents, 60%. So that could be a one-off gift, a fairly modest one, or it could be larger. So that's covering all forms. But even if we take that 60% saying they've received some form of support from their grandparents upon reaching adulthood, so could have been towards a new car or just living with them rent-free or providing, a bit towards a deposit for a house. We can compare the 60% of Gen Z who say they've received support upon, from their grandparents compared to the baby boomers who only 6% said, actually, my grandparents gave me financial support. So actually, Gen Z are 10 times more likely on that metric than the baby boomers to have had a leg up from their own grandparents as they kind of enter those adult years.
Well, I think it's great that they're not waiting until they pass away per se to make those gifts and help out. And it's something that I'm much more aware of as well, because you think about when grandparents might pass away by the time that the next generation, and you're talking about 2 generations below, but by the time the next generation inherit, they probably don't need it as much because they, if someone's passing away at 80, they had kids a lot younger, they're probably 60 by that point, 60 to 55. So they've already, gone through those struggle years of, trying to get enough for the family home, trying to upgrade their family home. It's awesome that they're now looking at, okay, we're still alive. Let's make great use of our money while we're still here, and we can see some of that joy of the next generations down using it. So, yeah, it's exciting.
It is. And it's a great point that actually that also, as you rightly pointed out, it shows, again, the changing kind of social dynamics that in the past, maybe that was the done thing was to leave that to the will and to not, that wasn't really done earlier. But now it seems more people in their, in that stage of life are recognizing the challenges for the emerging generations and thinking, well, I'd love to be able to be as helpful as possible and getting that head start on their first home. There's recognition that that's such a foundational support in life.
And while we're talking about, I guess, Gen Z and getting that help from potential grandparents, and have you still seen any evidence that home ownership is what is being aspired to? Or, you see different things in the media. It's like, is Gen Z still wanting to go and buy a home? I mean, I'll certainly be instilling that in my kids as a sort of core pillar to your stability and the wealth that you create. And even if they don't go on to do, lots of other investing around it, I think it's pretty important. But from what you see in the media, maybe that trend's going away. I don't know.
It's a good question. And the short answer is that the dream of home ownership is still very much there for Gen Z. The challenge and the issue is that for a lot of them, they think that dream is only going to be a dream. And so for some of them, they think, oh, I'll just give up on that dream and just pivot to just recognize that maybe it's just going to be renting for most of my life. So,
well, we have seen, our number one demographic of investor that we see from the East Coast is actually from Sydney, and they're priced out of there. So rather than do nothing, they figure, well, I might as well go and buy a 4x2 house for, 700, 800K over here, see if I can, do well enough to leverage myself into something that I really want one day. And so that's definitely a trend that we've seen just on our micro scale. So
well, it's a great pickup, and actually we've got some good data. If people Google financial freedom report, we produced that for one of our clients, but that's online, and that actually has some stats there on the dreams and aspirations of people and even the different generations as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll see if I can get those links and put them in the show notes for people, both your Trends 2025 report and your financial freedom one that you just mentioned, and the infographic. So really appreciate your time, and we'll see how things pan out this year. And I think, you're onto some definite winners there, or you're definitely picking them right, I think, from what I can see. So,
well, thanks, Jared. There's like you said at the start, there's so much changing, and so we're kept on our toes, but hopefully some of that can be helpful for listeners.
Awesome. Thanks, Grant. Appreciate your time. Have a good year ahead. See ya.
Just a reminder that the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.